All right, if you remember, a long, long time ago, we talked about young adulthood, physical and cognitive development. So today we're moving on to social and emotional development in the same age. Remember, young adulthood, we're looking at around like 18, 20-ish up to 40. So that's kind of the time period we're talking about here. We'll start as usual with Erikson's psychosocial stage, and you will see that the primary goal during young adulthood is to establish intimate connections with other people. That could be both in romantic relationships or in friendships or trying to even like build a family. And then the other main focus socially and emotionally during this time is developing a career or establishing a skill set that you can use to provide for yourself essentially. So according to Erikson, the main crisis during this time is called intimacy versus isolation. So intimacy involves making a commitment to a partner. Typically here we're talking about a romantic partner. But again, that can also involve establishing really close, long-lasting, lifelong friendships as well. Sometimes this can be very difficult. So kind of the primary challenge a lot of times in establishing a relationship is reestablishing an identity. So if you remember during adolescence, the focus is on identity. And during young adulthood, that's still continuing to some extent. And oftentimes then when you partner up with someone else who maybe their religious background is different, maybe their political beliefs are different than yours, maybe their hobbies are different, then all of a sudden you have to kind of start redefining your identity so that it more aligns with this partner that you have chosen. So young adults who are successful at that will fall on the side of intimacy. Those who are not successful will fall on the side of isolation. So people in isolation may be hesitant to form close bonds. They may not, they might be scared of commitment, or they may just have difficulty letting go of their identity and kind of fitting in with whoever their partner potentially could be. And identity plays a huge role, again, kind of all of this. So in general, those who have a secure identity, if you remember back to the 4 stages of identity development we talked about, those who reach like identity achievement, they are much more likely to have successful intimate relationships, to be faithful to their partners, and to have longer term romantic relationships. Those who are still in identity moratorium, that's that phase where you're really exploring and not really committed to a particular identity. They tend to be more likely to be like unfaithful in their relationships, scared of commitment. So kind of how well established your identity is during this phase can feed into how successful you are at establishing intimate relationships. We're on young adulthood, social and emotional development. And I believe I have all the PowerPoints for the rest of the quarter posted as well, so those should all be there. So that might be what threw you off, because there's quite a few after that one. All right, so since the primary goal is establishing intimate connections, then a lot of thought during this time goes into selecting a potential partner or a potential mate. There are a lot of things, so we're going to talk a little bit about what people look for in a mate, and for this particular discussion, I'm mostly talking about like heterosexual, cisgendered relationships. Unfortunately, there's not a ton of research on other types of sexual identities and gender identities and their relationship status or their mate selection preferences. So we're mostly focusing on that for this discussion. There are a lot of things that men and women have in common when they're searching out a mate. So for both genders, some of their top priorities tend to be things like just being similar. So oftentimes people who share similar backgrounds are more likely to be attracted and have a successful long-term relationship than those who do not. So if you've ever heard like the phrase opposites attract, that tends to not be true, at least for long-term relationships. So opposites may get together and have a very fast, passionate relationship that dies out quickly. But in order to have long-term commitment, you often need lots of similarity in political values, religious values, background, etc. So similarity is top for both genders. Then things like, just having a caring, kind personality, being dependable, being emotionally mature, all of those are important for both genders pretty much equally and tend to be at the top of their list for what they're looking for. But then once you get down to some of the other factors, we start to see some very predictable gender differences in terms of what people look for in a mate. There's a whole area of evolutionary psychology that tries to explain these gender differences. We don't talk about that a ton in this class, but in other classes I kind of go into more detail about it. But in general, I'll just give you kind of the gist of it. Basically, evolutionary psychologists argue that men and women have very different roles in rearing their offspring, and that contributes to a lot of these gender differences that we see. So just from like a factual, logistical standpoint, if a couple is going to have a kid, the woman is going to be pregnant for 9 months, and for that 9 months, she's going to have to make every single decision that will affect that offspring, whereas men don't have that 9-month commitment. So right away, women tend to have more invested in their offspring than men do. So that's just kind of one logistical fact that contributes to some of these differences I'll get to in just a second. In addition to that, historically, men had no way to be 100% certain that a child was their offspring until we developed, like paternity tests, which would have happened, I don't know, in the last 100 years or something. So all of evolution of humans would have happened long before that. So men couldn't be sure that the offspring that they were having were actually their own. So those main factors, and then the other one too is something we've already talked about, this idea that women's fertility tends to decline very quickly, whereas men's has this more gradual decline. So all three of those facts, according to evolutionary psychologists, contribute to some gender differences in what we tend to look for in a mate. So women, because they're already investing so much time and energy and resources into their offspring by dealing with the pregnancy, breastfeeding, etc., they tend to look for men who will meet that commitment, who will have resources available to them and will be willing to share those resources with the woman and the child. So because of that, women tend to value things like financial status, how much money a person has, things like their intelligence, ambition, and character, because they want to make sure they're getting really high quality genes that they can pass on to this offspring that they're going to spend lots of time taking care of. Women also tend to look for someone who's about the same age or slightly older, mostly because a man who's older is going to have more established career, more established resources that they can share. And women tend to care more about sort of psychological personality factors more than physical intimacy or physical appearance in general, because again, they're looking for a man that will commit and share their resources. Men, on the other hand, they have a very different strategy because they do not have to invest the 9 months into pregnancy. They don't have to breastfeed or any of that, again, especially historically, in evolutionary times. They have a strategy more of just, quantity, essentially. Women prefer quality, men prefer quantity. That's kind of the way you can break this down in a simple way. So men tend to look for physical attractiveness, something that indicates that their partner is young enough to still be fertile. So again, fertility drops pretty drastically at 35. So men are looking for traits that indicate that the woman is still in that younger, fertile stage. So most of the things that we as a society tend to attribute to, to think of as attractive in a female, they're kind of biological indicators of fertility. So for example, one of the main things that determines how attractive a female is perceived, for her body at least, is called the waist to hip ratio. So how wide your waist is compared to your hips. It's been found that women who have like a 0.7 ratio are considered most attractive. And there's some evidence that correlates with estrogen levels in the body. So women who have higher estrogen levels tend to have wider hips, essentially. And higher estrogen levels basically mean higher fertility. So when men are determining if a woman's physically attractive, basically, according to evolutionary psychologists at least, what they're looking at is this woman fertile? Can I get her pregnant if I copulate with her, essentially? So the other thing is that men value physical intimacy and fidelity much more than women do. Going back to that idea of men can't be sure if their offspring is their own, so men tend to care a lot more about physical infidelity than women do. If a woman cheats on a man, then maybe, the offspring she's carrying isn't his, so he's going to waste a bunch of resources on an offspring that's not even carrying his genes. So they tend to care a lot more about that than women do. Okay, so again, all of that is according to evolutionary psychologists. I just want to be clear, I'm not saying that any of that is how it should be. And I think a lot of these standards are changing, thankfully. because there is some cultural basis to a lot of this as well. Some of it's evolved, it's kind of ingrained in our genetics, the way our brain works, but a lot of it is also societal and cultural, and so there are some cultural changes to some of these differences. Anything else I want to say about that? I don't think so. Okay, so in young adulthood, we're in this pursuit to try to find intimate connections. We're going to be making selections of mates based on some of those things I just talked about. And the way that we function in a relationship is then going to depend a lot on the attachment styles that we had in childhood. So remember, we talked about childhood, we talked about these attachment styles between the parent and the child. And I told you that often these attachment styles will affect things then in the future. And here's one example of that. So typically people who have a secure attachment history, they had a secure relationship between themselves and their parent, that will kind of be modeled in their intimate relationships in young adulthood. So kind of the way that this is sometimes talked about is that we have an internal working model. That's kind of how we view relationships and how relationships should function or how they normally function. And that a lot of that internal model is developed based on what we see in our parents or our caregivers and the way that they interact with each other and with ourselves. So again, if you've had a secure attachment, you've developed this very healthy view of what a relationship should be like. So people with a secure attachment in childhood will typically be more comfortable with intimacy. They'll have basically more healthy and productive relationships as adults. So in their adult relationships, they'll be more likely to trust each other. They'll be happy with those relationships. They'll be able to develop good friendships, both with like people who are just friends, but also having a core friendship in their romantic relationships as well. They'll have stronger empathy, and they'll be good at what's called constructive conflict resolution. So one of the primary things, I might kind of come back to this again when we talk about divorce later, but one of the primary things that determines if a relationship will be successful or not is how that couple deals with conflict. So everyone's going to have conflicts in their relationships no matter what. There's no relationship on earth where like they never have disagreements about something. So the way that we deal with those conflicts is a huge part of what determines if a relationship is successful. So a good way to deal with conflict is to allow both parties to calmly express their goals and their desires and their needs, and for the other party to listen actively, which listening actively means that you are absorbing what the other person is saying without any judgment or without any filter, just kind of like listening to them, you know, and taking them at their word, basically. Asking for clarification anytime there is a misunderstanding or confusion, and for the other partner to make those clarifications. Compromising, you know, realizing that both people's needs are equal and valid and that we need to find a compromise between that. Being able to forgive, and also using humor is a huge part of successful conflict resolution. So those who have a secure attachment history, they're much more likely to use that approach to dealing with conflict, which then leads to a more successful relationship overall. If someone had a more avoidant attachment history in their childhood with their parents or their caregivers, then they may develop a sense of independence, mistrust, and anxiety. So they essentially may avoid relationships altogether. They may be scared of commitment, so they might have very short-term, like little flings or whatever, you know, hookups here and there, but they're not committed to a long-term relationship. They find that love is hard to find. Like I said, they might have casual sexual encounters. They often will be prone to jealousy, even in, you know, like very, you know, minor situations. If their partner even talks to someone else, they might get jealous or possessive. They may be emotionally distant. They don't provide support to their partner, and they also have unrealistic beliefs about what should happen in a relationship. And then they're also a lot less likely to use some of those constructive conflict resolutions I talked about before. So often someone who's avoidant, they will avoid conflict altogether. So they may have an issue that they're thinking of, like they're, you know, upset about something, but they won't say that to their partner. Instead, they'll just kind of keep it internalized and not talk about it. They may make like little passive-aggressive comments here and there to sort of let the partner know, but they're not going to like confront them, you know, straightforward, basically. And if the other partner, if the partner approaches them with an issue, if they have a conflict that they bring up, then the avoidant person will again try to avoid that conversation. They might just deflect. They might deny that there's a problem at all. They might stonewall, which is where they basically give the person the silent treatment, but they will not successfully engage in a conversation about the conflict. And then those with a resistant attachment history, they tend to try to dive into relationships very quickly without really knowing the other person. And they tend to look for what's called complete merging. Like they have this idea that a relationship should be where you and the partner become one, and everything you do, the other person should do, and everything you have, the other person should have. So it's almost like they want to be in a relationship with themselves, and they want the other person to be exactly like them, and they get very upset if they're not. So, someone who's resistant, they might meet someone and after only knowing them a week, might say that they love them and they want to move in with them. And then, like I said, they kind of want to share every single thing. So they tend to show a lot of jealousy and possessiveness. They tend to be very desperate, and they show that desperation a lot. They have emotional highs and lows. They may offer support or what they perceive as support, but often that support is not actually helpful to the partner or the other person. And they're also quick to express anger and fear. So someone who's resistant, if there's a conflict, they're likely to very quickly escalate to an emotional state. So normally when there's a conflict, we want emotions to be kind of tampered down, to deal with the situation in more of like a logical, rational way. But someone who's resistant, they might be sort of emotionally explosive when it comes to a conflict. They may, they might immediately kind of resort to, like if their partner approaches them to fight or whatever, they might immediately resort to saying that the partner doesn't love them or doesn't want to be with them, when really the partner is just trying to fix a minor issue. They usually will also let very minor things explode into something big. So if their partner approaches them and says, hey, you're always leaving your dirty laundry on the floor, can you try to pick that up? Then they might explode that into oh, you hate everything about me and you think I'm unclean and you think I'm disgusting or whatever. So they might take something minor and turn it into something really huge. So not a very good approach to dealing with conflict. So as you can imagine, avoidant and resistant often have lots of difficulties in their intimate relationships and may end up kind of on that side of isolation. Oh, other thing I should say about this, so even though a lot of this is correlated with attachment history in childhood, but there's quite a bit of research that shows that this is very flexible and that we can change our view of relationships in adulthood as long as we're exposed to a healthy model of what a relationship should look like. So if through all your childhood, all you're exposed to is parents who are avoidant and resistant and you're kind of modeling that behavior, but then in young adulthood, maybe you have some friends who have really healthy, good relationships that are more secure. Or you have an aunt and uncle or an aunt and an aunt or whatever that have a secure relationship and you can see that, then that will change that internal working model we have so then we can have a more secure relationship with other people. So this isn't permanent or set in stone, it is flexible and can be changed. Okay, so we seek out a mate. Hopefully we can find a secure attachment with that mate. And then as we are developing a relationship, there's this theory that basically says there's three main components to a healthy, successful, long-term relationship, and that you tend to kind of go through these in phases a little bit. So some components may be more strong during one part of the relationship and others weaker, and then they kind of shift around. So passion is really kind of like the sexual, physical attraction that we feel towards another person. So that is often very high in the early part of the relationship. When we have just met someone, we don't know very much about them. There's kind of this fun phase where you're getting to know every single thing. You're really highly physically attracted to this person. That's high levels of passion. So passion tends to be high at the beginning of the relationship. Then if the relationship lasts and is successful and secure, then you may move into a phase of companionship. Companionship is where you shift, kind of away from that physical attraction, and you're more focused on developing intimacy and trust and sharing values and this really warm, kind of affectionate relationship with the person. And then eventually that will crystallize into kind of compassionate love. So compassion is where we start to view this person almost as like a family member, like someone that I would give my life for, that I want to care for, I want them to be happy, I want to spend the rest of my life with them. That kind of like long-term commitment is what we would call compassion. So again, good, healthy relationships often have all three of these components, but you kind of go through phases as far as like which one is the dominant part of the relationship, depending on how long you stay together and how successful the relationship is. Any questions about romantic relationships before we move on to friendships? Okay. So remember, just a reminder, we're kind of talking from ages like 20 to 40 here. And friendships they're somewhat easy to make and maintain in like a college setting in early parts of young adulthood from like 18 to 24. But once you get past college, it can be very difficult for young adults to find friends and to maintain friendships. And there's quite a few reasons for that. One is that there's just less natural opportunities to meet people who are going to have similar interests. So throughout elementary school, high school, college, you're kind of forced to be in a social setting 8 hours a day or whatever, with people who often are going to be pretty like-minded, right? Like all of you are whatever major you are, so you probably have similar classes together. So you're around people who have kind of similar interests to you, who are your same age, who maybe have similar hobbies, you're in clubs or whatever. There's lots of opportunity to make friends. But then once you graduate from college, you go into a job or career, it can be much more difficult to find those like natural places where you can form friendships. You might think a work setting could kind of become that, and sometimes it can. It really depends on the culture of the job and like what industry you're working in. But a lot of times in a job, there's going to be more diversity compared to what you would see in like a college setting. By diversity, I don't mean necessarily like ethnic or gender. I mean just more like general interests, right? Like the people I work with are often very different from me. And especially in other, maybe in academics, it's not quite as much, but like my husband, for example, has worked more in like retail jobs. And he often has people working with him that are, you know, major age spectrum all the way from like 20s up to 60s. They have all kinds of different political backgrounds and religious backgrounds, etc. So it can be really hard to even find someone who's similar to begin with in a job setting. And then on top of that, when you're working with someone, the dynamics are a little different. Like there's often a kind of competitiveness or a rivalry potentially. You might be competing for a promotion, or you have to worry about kind of like hierarchical things. Like if you make friends with someone but then they get promoted above you, that changes the whole dynamic. So it can just be really hard to make friends at work is what I'm saying. And then outside of work, there's not necessarily a lot of natural settings to find friends. People who are successful at making friends in this later part of young adulthood, typically it's because they are exploring lots of hobbies and things that are social in nature. So maybe they are trying to join clubs that are available to adults, going to classes that are available to adults or whatever. Then they can find friends there. And then even maintaining friends can be difficult because you have all these responsibilities that are piling up, right? You graduate from college, you have a job. Usually now you're going to be married, so you have a spouse you're spending all your time with. So if you want to make friends, then like not only do you have to like the person, but your spouse also has to like the person usually. Then you might also have kids that you're raising. And so it's difficult even to just find time to spend with friends. So all that kind of summarized, friendships are very hard to form and maintain in later young adulthood. Some of the gender differences in friendship from adolescence continue. So if you remember, we talked a little bit about how men and women typically have different activities they do in their same gender friend groups. So men tend to, be more likely to try to engage in activities, play sports, play video games, like doing something, whereas women tend to just like sit and chat, spend more time talking. So that continues into young adulthood. There's also an increase in cross-gender friendships, so like men being friends with women and vice versa, particularly in like a work setting and especially for women. So women, as they get into a career, especially depending on what career path they go into, they often might be surrounded by men, so they are more likely to make friends with men and have those like cross-gender friendships. Any questions about friendships? Okay. Another part of this whole like intimacy versus isolation in young adulthood is then establishing a family. So again, someone has, maybe found a mate, settled into a committed relationship, then they may be looking to start a family. So there's a couple stages to this. The very beginning, you're leaving home and establishing your own path, going to college, making friends, finding a romantic partner, etc. Stage 2, you're committing to that intimate partner. That commitment could be through marriage, or it could just be through a long-term relationship, cohabitating, etc. And then stage 3 is having children. We'll talk more about some of the other stages as we get into middle adulthood. Let's see, what else do I want to say about this? So in stage 2, when you're committing to an intimate partner, some of the difficulties, I would say that oftentimes the most stressful time in life is when we're transitioning between these stages. So when we're transitioning from, home to college, very stressful. When we're transitioning to being in a committed relationship, can be very stressful. Having children, obviously, very stressful. Some of the stresses that come particularly with committing to an intimate partner is, I already talked about how you're rearranging your identity. That's one. Another one is that you're often joining families. So it's not just, person A marrying person B, but it's family A marrying family B in some cases, depending on how close-knit those families are. And so there's all kinds of issues that can come up in that interaction between the two different families, especially if there are different backgrounds. If you have like a biracial relationship, or you have a relationship where, one family's really religious, the other family's not. Then all those dynamics become very complicated and sometimes messy, and you have all kinds of conflict. Let's see. Let me back up a little bit. I kind of got ahead of myself. So let's talk a little bit more about leaving home. So the age that people leave their home has been gradually increasing over the past 60 years. So it used to be pretty common that if someone graduates high school at 18, they move out on their own. That's becoming less and less common. People are often sticking around in their home base until, early 20s or so. And more than 50% of people who leave their original household will return at least once at some point in time. Maybe because they lose a job, they lose their financial stability. Maybe it's just a break, summer break at college or whatever. So even if someone leaves at 18, they're very likely to return back home. There's lots of factors that influence how likely someone is to leave earlier. Typically, people who are coming from a divorced home, they have step parents or half siblings, things like that. They're more likely to leave earlier to get out of that household usually. And then there's also cultural differences. So African American and Hispanic youth tend to stay at their home base longer. They may have more close-knit relationships with their family that keeps them there, or they may have, the responsibilities helping to care for their family. And they're also more likely to return home as well if they do leave. Typically, those who get a higher degree, or are more educated are less likely to return home. It's probably pretty obvious. If they can get more financial stability, they're less likely to have to move back in with their parents. In addition to people leaving the home later, people are also marrying later. So it used to be that the average age of a woman's first marriage about 100 years ago was 20. Now it's up to 27. So most people don't get married until they're at least 27. Let's see, also 100 years ago, 60% of women between the age of 18 and 29 were married. Right now it's only 16%. So it went from 60% to 16%. So yeah, overall age of getting married is going up pretty drastically. But that's probably due to lots of reasons. I'm sure one of the main ones is just the fact that women are able to get an education and a career much more than they were 100 years ago. So they're kind of putting off marriage until they've established a career. I'm trying to remember what other slides I have. If I should talk more about marriage here. No, we'll talk more about that in a little bit. We'll also talk more about having kids a little bit as well. I do want to mention some other relationship statuses because obviously not everyone gets married or commits to a relationship. And the number of people marrying overall is also going down. So the age at which we get married is getting later and later, and then the number of people who never get married is higher and higher. So let's talk just a little bit about some of kind of the outcomes of people who are in other relationship statuses. Let me see where I have that. I think I'm missing something in my notes, maybe. So I might have to just wing this part, which is fine. There it is. Okay. So, like I said, there are more single adults. So about 8 to 10% of people now remain single for their entire life. They will never get married or fall into any of these other categories. It used to be, so in my notes I have that women are more likely to stay single, but I think that's a pretty outdated statistic because recently there's a lot of stuff saying that actually males, especially like young males in their 20s, are much more likely to be single than any other demographic and much more likely than like times previously. So that seems to be much more common for men at this point than for women. Let's see. Cohabitating is, you guys probably know this, but it's basically where you're living with someone that you're in a committed, usually sexual relationship with, but you're not yet married. So numbers of people cohabitating is going up pretty drastically as well. Cohabitation used to be kind of frowned upon, especially by people with strong religious backgrounds, but it's becoming more acceptable. There is some data that shows that people who cohabitate and go on to get married are more likely to get divorced than those who didn't cohabitate to begin with. But the reason for that is probably, like if you think about it, if you have someone who's super religious versus not religious, which one would be more likely to cohabitate, do you think?
The non-religious.
Yeah, someone who's not religious is probably more likely to cohabitate. Someone who's super religious probably has beliefs that like you shouldn't live with or have sex with someone you're not married to, right? And then at the same time, who's more likely to get divorced? Someone who's super religious or someone who's not religious? Probably someone who's not religious, right? Because most people who are super religious have a belief that divorce is a very bad thing. You should only do that as like an absolute last resort. So that correlation between cohabitating and later getting divorced is probably really just driven by people who are not very religious are more likely to cohabitate, and they're also more open to getting divorced. So there's not any evidence that like cohabitating causes bad relationships or something like that. And in fact, that correlation between cohabitating and divorce, it goes down the larger the number of people that cohabitate, the smaller that correlation becomes. Does that make sense? So it kind of seems like a lot of that has to do with just like religious beliefs, kind of like I was saying. Because I also have, later in my notes, it says that sometimes cohabitating can reduce rates of divorce, which kind of makes sense if you think about it logically, right? If you take the time to live with someone, so you get to know what their patterns are like, you get to know what it's like to live in a house with them every day, then you're still committed to that person, even though you know that they leave their laundry on the floor, they don't do their dishes or whatever, then you have less reason to divorce them later on, right? Whereas if you wait until you're married to move in with someone and then you discover on day one that you're married, like, wow, this person's a slob and I didn't know that, then that might drive divorce. So when you take the religious component out of it, cohabitating is actually probably good for relationships. Yeah?
Are people who are not religious more likely to get divorces overall?
Yes.
Okay, because I was wondering, because I know a lot of people who are religious who have gotten divorces. So
Yeah, and that's another one of those things that's probably changing, and like whatever statistics I've read about it are probably outdated. Because yeah, it definitely used to be the case that, a lot of religious beliefs were like you shouldn't get divorced unless it's like, something very drastic. So, yeah. Okay, so we have single people, cohabitation. We talked quite a bit about marriage. I'm trying to think. I'm sorry, I'm struggling with my organization today, but I felt like I had one more slide on marriage, and now I'm thinking maybe I don't. So we can talk more about marriage here. So we have people who are single, cohabitating, some who are married. We talked about some of the challenges of transitioning to that. So, you're joining families together, you've got identity issues. Another major challenge in marriage is just defining roles. of the couple. So once you're married, you got to figure out who's going to do the dishes, who's going to do the childcare, who's going to, balance the budget of the bills, etc. So when you're bringing two people together in a household, establishing those roles can be very difficult. There's a difference, so some of the terms that are used to describe that are traditional versus egalitarian. So traditional marriages are where, you've got the woman has the traditional womanly roles of cooking, cleaning, raising children, and the man has the role of like providing an income, and is kind of like the head of the household. That's called the traditional marriage. And egalitarian marriage is where there's more of an even split in roles across the genders. So men and women both take on the role of, providing financial support. They both are contributing to cleaning and cooking and raising children, etc. In general, in modern times at least, egalitarian marriages tend to have higher rates of satisfaction than traditional marriages, especially for the woman in the relationship. Women tend to get much more satisfaction out of egalitarian relationships. Some people can transition, so yeah, go ahead.
Can you spell egalitarian?
Egalitarian.
Egalitarian.
Yeah, I'll put it on the board. So many relationships will actually see shifts between these roles. So a lot of relationships might start out egalitarian whenever they're first, cohabitating, or they're early in marriage. But then often, once the first child is born, that relationship will likely switch to a more traditional role set where the woman is doing most of the child care and cleaning, and the man is more focused on, like income and all of that. And then as the child gets a little bit older, it'll kind of transition back to that egalitarian phase. So having kids can really disrupt those roles pretty substantially. We need to keep talking about having kids while we're here too. There's also, so just like everything else I've said, there's also a trend towards delaying having kids as well. So we're delaying leaving the house, delaying getting married. More people are single for longer or for potentially the lifespan. And we're also delaying having kids to a later date. And again, that's probably mostly due to women having more access to education and career, so they're putting off childbearing. We also have much more access to like birth control and things than we used to. So people are actually deciding when they want to have kids instead of just accidentally getting pregnant, which happens. One of the main things that drives people's decision to either delay having kids or to just not have kids at all is the financial cost. So again, this is a number that's almost certainly outdated because I think this comes from like 2016. But there's a figure that it costs about $300,000 to get a kid from birth to 18. And again, that's probably way higher now with inflation and everything. You could probably basically double that. So kids are extremely expensive and time consuming. So lots of people opt to just not have kids at all or to at least wait until they're financially stable. Transitioning to parenthood has a lot of the same stresses as transitioning to being married. Again, like reestablishing roles, switching from egalitarian to traditional, etc. Okay, so then the rates of divorce are also increasing. I don't think I have statistics in here, but the last number I had heard is that about 50% of marriages will end in divorce. So it's becoming more and more common. It was kind of drastically increased from like 1960s to 1990s. That divorce rate went way up. And then around the 90s, it kind of stabilized and seems to maybe even be going down a tiny bit now. We talked about this a little bit, but there are kind of certain time periods within a relationship that divorce is more likely to happen. So marital satisfaction tends to be highest right at the beginning of the marriage. So, you've got that kind of like honeymoon phase where, it feels like everything's amazing and everyone's super happy. By the time they have their first child, that satisfaction rate will drop pretty drastically. I can maybe kind of draw this graph on the board. I have it in my notes. I should have put it in the PowerPoint. So these numbers are basically the percentage of people saying that they're satisfied with their marriage. So around, like at the very beginning, about 35% 37% of people say that they're happy with their relationship all the time. Okay, so that's kind of a key part. You might think like that's really low, less than 40% of people are happy, but they're saying they're happy with their relationship all the time, like they have no problems whatsoever. Then by the time, let's see, when they have their first child, drops about 10%, so down to about 30. By the time their child is like school aged, so like in elementary school, it drops to about 10%. So kind of this low point here is about 10%. And then it'll kind of shift back up as the child like graduates and leaves home. So around like retirement is when it gets back to its peak again. And a lot of this probably has to do with all these issues I was talking about before. So you can imagine if you're in this egalitarian relationship to start, you know, man and woman are both equally contributing, everybody's really happy, then they have a kid, and all of a sudden all those roles go out the window, and maybe the man's not contributing as much as the woman had hoped, maybe the woman's not keeping up her appearance as much because she's breastfeeding and she's up all night or whatever. That's why you get this drastic drop around the first year. And then as we get to school age, so this is all tracking the age of the first child. So by school age, they likely would have had maybe a second and even a third child at this point. So then they've gone through that transition of shifting from egalitarian to traditional, back to egalitarian, maybe a little bit back to traditional multiple times. And you have now more children that you're taking care of. That's taking up all your time. You have less time to invest in yourself, in your health, and your physical appearance. You have less time to invest in your relationship, so it drops a little bit. And then as the children age, become more autonomous, eventually they leave the house, then you kind of get rid of some of those difficulties, and it goes back up. The interesting thing, so that's kind of the explanation that I've read and been told multiple times, what I just described to you about, like kind of blaming this on the kids a little bit. But the interesting thing is if you look at couples who get married and don't have kids, but you just track like year 1, year 2, year whatever, this graph looks almost identical. So I don't know what to make of that. I don't know what that means. I mean, it obviously tells you that it's not the kids that are causing the issue, but I also don't know, like, what is it about, you know, this would maybe be, most people have a kid after about a year of marriage, so this would be year 1, and then their school age around year, like, 5, right, you're like 5 when you go to preschool, so that would be year 6 of the marriage, right, like, I don't know, what is it about year 6 of a marriage that tanks all of a sudden? No clue, couldn't tell you, I don't know. It might just be, could even be due to like those phases I was talking about, like passion versus companionship versus compassion. Maybe there's shifting things happening there. Those might not necessarily always line up. So like the woman in a relationship and the man in a relationship, one of them might want more passion and one of them might want more companionship. And as you're like shifting through those phases, maybe it leads to more conflict. I don't know. We could sit here and hypothesize all day, but something about year 6. It's like if you can make it through that, then probably you'll stay together forever. I don't know.
I had a question too though. What about people who've been married for like 32 years?
They'd be more kind of over on this tail end. So like they'd be more likely to be satisfied and happy with their relationship, I would say. But you've still got, I mean, a lot of people below this number, right? So however many, 35 to 40 are saying they're super happy, that leaves 60% saying they're not. So I don't know. It depends on way too many factors, I guess.
I just always wonder why people who are married for that long.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's 37 years with someone.
Yeah.
Or did I say 32? That's a long time.
Either way, yeah. Yes. It's, yeah. I don't know. Okay. Anything else I want to say about divorce? I don't think so. All right, so then many people will go on to get remarried. I could have swore I had the percentage, but I don't see it in front of me now. Yeah, I don't see it. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. I don't want to tell you a wrong number. So if somebody wants, you could Google how many people remarry after divorce. I want to say it's pretty high, but I don't remember the percent off the top of my head. Most of those who do remarry, they'll do it within 4 years of the initial divorce. So if they're not remarried after 4 years, it's more likely that they won't. The second marriage is more likely to divorce than the first marriage. So every iteration of being remarried is more vulnerable to divorce than the previous ones. Which might just be, that doesn't necessarily mean that the second marriage is like less healthy than the first marriage. It might just be that people who are willing to get divorced once then they go through the divorce experience and maybe they realize like it's not as bad as they thought, right? Maybe they are putting off getting divorced because they're terrified of like all the consequences that could come from that. Then they do it and then they realize like, okay, this wasn't that bad. I got divorced and moved on. And so then they're in a second relationship. If that second relationship starts to have issues, then they may be more likely to be like, okay, I've already been through divorce once. It wasn't that bad, so I'm going to go ahead and get divorced now because I'm not happy with this relationship, right? So that could just be kind of like a self-selection thing. People who've gotten divorced before are open to getting divorced again. Otherwise, remarriages, they suffer from challenges that you won't see in the first relationship. You might be marrying families again, so you could have, stepchildren. Trying to step into the role of a step-parent can be very difficult. Making decisions about how involved you should be in the child's life. Should you try to act like their parent? Should you not? All that becomes very tricky. All right, I think that's all our relationship statuses. Any questions about any of those before we move on to talking about career? Okay, so in addition to establishing intimate relationships, both romantic and friendships, establishing a career is kind of the other main priority in young adulthood. A lot of people will experience disappointment at the start of their career. So people, you may go to college with a particular major, you have a career path in mind. Often throughout college and early young adulthood, most of the things you're learning about that career path are going to be the positives. You're going to be thinking about how much money you're going to make and how much you're going to be able to, change the world or whatever it is you want to do with your career. And you don't necessarily learn a lot about the negatives or the drawbacks of a particular career path until you're in it and you're established. So then once you get into that career path, there may be all kinds of disappointments. You may realize that the job is not what you expected it to be. Maybe you don't have as much autonomy as you had hoped for. Maybe you have a boss that's micromanaging everything you do, which you weren't expecting. Maybe you realize that you're not going to make as much money as you thought, or maybe you realize that that money doesn't go as far as you thought because of inflation and mortgage rates and everything else. You may find that just like what you get from the job is not what you expected. It's kind of the most general way I could say that. So maybe you think that going into this career is going to be really rewarding because you're going to impact people's lives in some way, and then you realize like, no, that's not actually what this job is. So there can be a lot of disappointment early on at the start of a career. One thing that can help with that that's very important is finding a good mentor. So often the best way to find a good mentor is to identify someone who is, maybe 5 or 10 years further ahead in their career path and who is kind of at the point where you would like to be in 5 or 10 years. So kind of trying to find someone that you could model the path that they took and asking them for advice, trying to establish a relationship with them so that they can help you navigate all the difficulties of a career can be very important. Establishing a career is often more difficult for women and people of color, other marginalized groups like LGBTQ folks. And finding a good mentor can be even more important for those groups than for others. So typically like women or ethnic minorities who are able to find a good mentor have much better career outcomes than those who do not. Some of the reasons that women have difficulty in career paths, one is just like stereotypes that have been embedded into lots of our cultures and industries, where people maybe just assume that women aren't going to be as good at a career as a man, so they don't get paid as much, they are less likely to get promotions, etc. They may also face things like sexual harassment, which can be very stressful. And then in addition, they've got all this other stuff going on, with marriage and kids that can be much harder to balance that work-life balance than it might be for a man. Kind of similar things for ethnic minorities. So often they might, face like discrimination or bias in the workplace. They may have stereotypes where people assume they're not going to be as good at a particular job. And so again, having a positive, good mentor can help with a lot of those issues. Just to kind of like drive this point home, there's been quite a few studies that have been done. You guys might have heard of these, I don't know, where people have crafted resumes, and they will take like the exact same resume, but they'll just change the name. So they'll change it so there'll be one male name and one obviously female name, or they'll have like a name that sounds Caucasian versus a name that sounds like an ethnic minority, but everything else about the resume is identical. And they'll send out those resumes to thousands of companies to see who gets callbacks and who doesn't. And they often find that women and ethnic minorities are discriminated against. So even though it's the exact same resume they're getting, they're more likely to call the resume that has the white male-sounding name than any of the other names. So we know from all kinds of studies that there's these biases in the workplace against women and ethnic minorities.